But with that, I go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Faber.
Thank you. And, this is really an important lesson to be flexible. A gardener is always learning how to do things and following rules and doing things that are going to make it possible to, I don't know, grow the best flower, the biggest flower, whatever. And and you can't always do it on a schedule. It's, for example, we're going to be doing a pruning class here, I hope. And, people say, oh, you have to prune in January, you've got to prune in. No, you can prune any time of the year. And, that's witnessed by our lemon growers here. They're pruning all the time. And so you can prune a tree at any time. It's just that with deciduous trees, you can do it when you can see the structure of the tree, and it makes it easier to see what you're doing. But a lot of times commercially, growers will prune 3 times during the year in order to achieve the shape that they want. So we're going to be talking about the hardest thing in the world, aside from raising kids. And the problem is we live in a climate that doesn't lend itself to scheduling at all. And so the worst example probably is growing blueberries. Blueberries have got a very shallow root system. And on a day like today, you might irrigate them 3 times. And then when there's no wind, you may not irrigate again for another 3 weeks. So you've got to be flexible with irrigations. And automatic timers are great if you're on holiday or something like that. But if you're at home, follow the weather and what's happening. And I would say easily 80% of the problems I see in agriculture, and this means all of the problems, labor problems for one thing, but certainly disease problems and insect problems go back to plant health. And if you don't irrigate right in this irrigated culture, you're not going to have a healthy plant. So we're going to talk about, I'm easily sidetracked, but we're going to talk about the whole plant and how water affects the plants and how it affects soil and that sort of thing. So with that, let's take off. And so this is a, let's see, I want to get rid of my picture. This is a, I would like to say this is the ultimate chemistry that happens in plants. And you probably all know this, carbon dioxide plus water plus energy from the sun comes in and creates sugar and oxygen that we breathe. And this works backwards too. So we take that sugar and oxygen and it releases carbon dioxide and water. And this is a simple energy balance equation that you'd think every kid would know, and they probably do, and we've forgotten. This is photosynthesis and this is respiration. And it's not well known, but when plants don't have sun, at night they respire and they generate CO2. Okay, so plants actually will generate carbon dioxide as well. But during daylight hours, they produce oxygen. Now, this is the question. How can I tell when to irrigate? Because a plant that has too much water looks wilted, and a plant that has not enough water looks wilted. And on the helpline, people are going to say, how much water do I put on my azalea? How much water do I put on my roses? How much? And we're going to talk about how to answer those people. But a lot of folks just wanted, a menu that they can draw from, or a cookbook, and you just can't do that. You can't do it in Fresno, where I grew up, and you certainly can't do it here. Coastal climates are so variable. We went from, what did we get here in Ventura? It was about 8 inches of rainfall. And had cold soils, and then we had a Santa Ana conditions, and a lot of trees collapsed, not because there wasn't adequate water in the soil, it was because they were transpiring so fast the roots couldn't keep up with them. So it can be really confusing about how to irrigate. Now, that formula I showed you is, you know, I hate to pick on engineers, but engineers try and, you know, make things really simple. And there was this attempt called Biosphere 2 in Arizona. It was in the 1990s. And there was this huge greenhouse that was, I think it was about 5 or 8 acres, and it had a rainforest in it, and a desert, and a prairie, and had all these different things. And they put about 10 people into this and closed it up. And they said, okay, this is a system that is going to, you know, provide adequate food and water. And after about 18 months or so, people started getting really, really sick because the carbon dioxide changed and the oxygen changed and the temperature, they couldn't keep up. So I'm trying to reinforce this idea that there's no, you know, set way to approach irrigation. Anyway, so in order for growth to occur, a plant must lose water. Okay, so the plant is taking up water from the soil. The water moves up through the stem into the leaves, and water moves out. And for carbon dioxide to move in, water has to move out. So a necessary consequence of plant growth is water use. And we call that a beneficial use. So this all occurs through the stomata, which are these little openings that are controlled by potassium. Okay, so potassium moves into this ring here, and it swells up, and then potassium is removed, and the stomata close. And so this typically follows a response to sunlight. And when the sunlight goes down, then the stomata close. So many plants lose their water during the day. They take up carbon dioxide during the day. And then at night, they shut the stomata in order to conserve water, because there's not photosynthesis to cause the carbon dioxide conversion through photosynthesis into sugar. Now there's other plants, you know, there's plants that use what's called the crassulation acid metabolism, which is what cacti use. And then there's another technique that clever plants, you know, like corn and sorghum use another metabolic pathway to take up carbon dioxide. But it all happens through the stomata. There's actually openings in tree stems called lenticels that are very similar, and they are not as responsive to sunlight and opening, but you know, primarily it's the leaves that lose water and take up carbon dioxide. Okay, so no leaves, no water loss. Okay, if you don't have leaves on a tree, you can't use water. So one of the first things that people do when they see leaf drop in a plant is they start watering it. And there's no way for the water to be lost. So you just soak the soil. And the #1 disease in plants, okay, so you all know about powdery mildew in roses and botrytis in strawberries. But across all plant species, it's root diseases in California. And that's because we irrigate and we either put on too much water or too little water. So you've got to look at the whole plant. What's going on in the whole plant? And a diseased tree or plant will often lose its leaves, and the plant owner's response often is to put more water in, and that just exacerbates the situation. So this water that's going into the plant and up the stem and through the leaves is called transpiration. Okay, and it's a continual movement. And if there's no water in the soil, there's no water going into the plant. there's no leaves, there's no water going out of the leaves, so there's no way for the water in the soil to move through the tree or whatever the plant is. And so this is called it's like a train. It's the concatenary movement of water. It's pulling, water pulls, it sticks to each other. The molecules stick. And so it's pulled along. And if there's no way for the water to move out of the leaf, water just stays in the plant. Something to remember too is that water that is moving through a plant and out the leaf is cooling the leaf. And I bring this up because we've had some problems here in the last several years with normal summer temperatures of 75 or 80 degrees going to 115 and 117. And a plant that doesn't have water can't move water through the leaves and cool itself through evaporation. And so, when you're aware of a high water demand, and high water demand doesn't occur just with heat, it happens with wind and high sunlight too. So right now with the Santa Ana blowing, there's a lot of water that's being pumped out of the tree. It's not as serious. I mean, you'll get a droughty root system, but if it's a heat spell of 117, not only are you not cooling the leaf, the plant's probably going to shed that leaf because it gets too hot. So here's transpiration. This is coleus plant inside of a Pyrex beaker, and it shows that transpired water that's coming out of the leaf, and it condenses on the sides of the glass. So that process is also called evaporation. So transpiration and evaporation are driven by the same physical processes, and it's often hard to distinguish the two. So after you've watered the soil, it's wet, and the plant is taking up water, and it's losing water through the leaves, but it's also losing water from the surface of the soil through evaporation. So because the water that's being lost from a whole area can't be fully accounted for through one or the other processes, we call this evapotranspiration. So this is the water that is lost from an area. So you're losing water not just from the plant, but also from the soil. So in effect, you're watering the soil because you're getting evaporative loss. And the less soil that you water, the less evaporative loss. So that's why people go to drip irrigation, because you've got a smaller area to lose water. So this is water that's lost from an area. It's called evapotranspiration, and it's being driven by these physical processes, primarily the sun, but it's the wind and the heat and humidity. So this is a trick question, and I don't know how to do this over Zoom. Is there a way of showing the number of hands or something? Or anyway, so evapotranspiration is being driven by 4 primary processes: sun, which is day length, the clouds. And this thing about sunlight is that on an overcast day, there's going to be less energy arriving to drive evapotranspiration. When we have a lot of clouds, there's less evapotranspiration. In the wintertime, in theory, because the day length is shorter, we have less evapotranspiration. And then wind, and we all know that when we go out walking and it's windy, you come home and the first thing you do is get a drink of water. And so wind is a really important factor in driving water use. And humidity. So if you all know about Hawaii and Florida and situation down in Panama and places, Brazil, I guess wherever you are, and it's humid, you sweat and you don't dry out and you get hot. and you don't have evaporative cooling occurring. So when you have dry conditions, you have more water demand than in situations when you have high humidity. So this is really interesting. Here in Ventura, when you're along the coast, typical humidity, daytime, winter, summer, is about 50% relative humidity. And then when you go out to Fillmore or Thousand Oaks, you get a real variation in humidity. It goes down to 5%, 8%, 10%. And at other times it can be higher. So when you have low humidity, you have high water demand. And then of course, temperature. And temperature is the factor that most people respond to. Oh, it's a hot day. Oh, it's a cold day. So temperature, has a play in water demand in plants. But this is all leading up to this question: how do you prioritize these factors? Now, you can't completely separate them, because on a cold day, you have high humidity, that goes together physically. But the thing that really, really, really drives water demand is going back to those stomata. The stomata open and close according to sunlight. So when they're open, they are capable of losing water. When they're closed, they're not. So the shorter the day, the less water demand. Okay, so sunlight is that's the most important factor. So and then wind. Wind is really important. Humidity is important, and temperature is the least important factor. And yet we're responding to temperature. And so we say, oh, it's a January, it's a cold, humid day with lots of sun, and the wind is blowing, and plants don't need water. But oftentimes July, when we have, or May or June, when we have May gray and there's no sun, the water demand can be higher in January than it is in May. And that's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to irrigate here. It's water. So the most important factor is sun, almost as important as wind and humidity and temperature. Now there's these automated sprinkler systems that use a controller, and it'll be adjusted to the latitude, and then it will use a factor, just temperature, and figure out, okay, you can irrigate once a week or once a day or once every 2 weeks, something like that. So I mean, you can simplify this in a way, but it gets less and less accurate as you remove the measurement of all these other factors.
Dr. Faber, there is a question. Melissa would like to know, is that because our temperature doesn't change that much?
No, our temperatures, it can be 80 degrees during the day and it can drop down to 45 degrees. It's a tremendous variation in temperature. I grew up in Fresno, and July 1st is 100 degrees all day, all night until October 1st. Now that is, homeostasis. That's a condition where nothing changes. And these coastal environments are just phenomenally variable, so it,
right.
It seems cool. Well, it is cool compared to Bakersfield.
Yes.
But that temperature variation is tremendous along the coast here. Any other questions?
No, that's it for now. I grew up in Fresno too, so I completely can identify all that comment. That's why I live here on the coast.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So, when I was a kid, I'd lie there sweating in bed. My mom would come in and say, just be calm, just be calm. And it's hot. Anyway.
We saw Charlie. Charlie just confessed to being a Fresno native as well. Good job, Charlie. You're part of the club.
Yeah. We had swamp coolers on the roof, and we'd come home from school and just lie down on the the floor under the swamp cooler trying to cool off.
Yeah, talk about being humid, right, in the house. Oh gosh,
Yeah.
it was horrible, horrible.
Yeah.
Anyway, we should get back.
Yes, yes. So now this is some other factor that we often forget about when it comes to watering, and that water loss is it's dependent on the amount of area that's watered. Okay, so if you're out in the desert and there's nothing planted, there's no water use, right? And so you put a daisy in, or whatever grows out there, Ariogatum, and you know, boom, as soon as there's leaf area, you start losing water. And as the plant grows, it uses more and more water. Okay, so it's a big plant uses more water than a little plant. That's so simplistic that we often forget about that. Okay, so if you have a plant in a pot and it's in a little pot, it's got just so much area of the plant and soil that it can lose water. So as the plant gets bigger, you put on more and more water. And so this cartoon here represents that, you know, idea is that as area increases, the amount of water you use increases. So a big lawn uses more water than a little lawn, right? You know, and so this is one of the difficult things to get across to the helpline. You know, when somebody calls up and says, how much water do I put on? You say, well, you put on 1 inch per 100 square feet. And somebody says, well, what's 100 square feet? You put on 1 inch per 1,000 square feet. Well, what's 1,000 square feet? And, you know, dimensions become very difficult for people to understand. Okay, so this is a real life example from the days when San Fernando Valley was planted to oranges and walnuts and lemons to a certain extent. And this was water use that was measured over a period of time. Okay, over a period of time. And it was looking at water use that was coming from a stand of alfalfa and from orange trees that had some interplanting of what we call a cover crop. Basically, it had weeds growing in between the trees. And this is where they controlled the weeds, yeah, right here. And it looked at the amount of water used in these 3 situations, with a whole area planted, with one that was partially planted, and then one where we just had trees. And then it looked at the demand that came from this, the water use that was coming from a lake, whatever it was there. And it was an artificial lake. There was no water in the San Fernando Valley other than what was in the ground until they brought in Owen's river water, and then boom, that's when everything started growing. Anyway, in this case, this shows as the area that's planted increases, the greater the water demand.
Hello.
Okay, so this goes back to, you know, this xeriscaping sort of idea, is that, you know, one of the things is that, you know, some people think, well, I'm going to put in these little plants, okay, and they're on drippers, and I'm going to put it on a timer, and it's going to put out 1 gallon per plant every week, and I'm going to leave that that controller on like that, and then the plants keep growing, and they don't change the controller. You know, the plants are growing, so they're going to need more water. You know, and you know, these are ideas that are hard to get across to a lot of people. You know, you may understand this, but a lot of homeowners don't. A lot of growers don't. Oh my God. So let's skip that one. So what we do is we look at, this is the evapotranspiration. This is the amount of water that's used by an avocado tree. And we can measure this the way we measure rainfall. Okay, we know that we have a rain gauge, and it collects 1/2 inch of rainwater, or over 3 days, it collects 2 inches of rainwater, something like that. So we can understand how much water is used. And we often will measure this by the depletion of water from the soil. And I won't get into that, but so we can figure out how much water is used by my little pointer doesn't work very well. How much water is used. And then we can figure out how much water how long to run the irrigation system to replace that amount of water. Okay, so I got a call today from somebody in Carpinteria who wanted to know how much water their avocados used on 5 acres. And I said, I can't tell you that, and it turns out it's a family of plumbers and they've got a well. And I said, well, you can either use the meter that's on the well. Oh, we don't have a meter. Oh, okay, well, how much is your water being put out per emitter? So the emitters are measured in, half a gallon or 10 gallons per hour. Well, how long did you run the system? And they had electric bills, so they could figure out by the amount of electricity used, they could figure out their pumping, and then by the amount of water put out, they could figure out, oh, I've put out this amount of water. So I said, okay, for the whole year, how much water did you put out? And they've said, oh, it works out to this. So you can always do some calculations to figure the amount of water used. Okay, so this is a map of average evapotranspiration. Okay, remember evapotranspiration in another way is the amount of energy arriving in the system to drive potential water use. And if you've got concrete out there, you'll have no water use, but you still have the energy coming in to potentially drive water use. If that concrete is actually grass, then this is the amount of water that would be used. So in July, okay, we have these maps of California, and there's certain areas. Here's the Central Valley, here's the Sierras, and so there's these ISO lines that define given environments, these niches that have different water demands. And this changes from seasonally. So this one is in January when it's cooler, usually these ISO lines change. And we've actually got a map that was drawn by Bob Brendler, who was in our office from the 50s until the 1990s. And this shows the ISO line here in Ventura. And this is the line that shows the effect of the immediate effect of the coast. And this is the next ISO line right here. And here's the third ISO line. There's a fourth one out here. And you can see this when you drive 126 from Ventura out to Fillmore. There are these very distinct spots where right here on 126 is right about Victoria, Victoria. And right here is, where's my pointer? Right here is 118. Then you get out here, in between Santa Paula and Fillmore, and there's you can feel a temperature change. It goes boom. I mean, it's amazing how distinct these areas are. And so each one of these has a different micro niche, and the water demand is going to change. And so, here's Thousand Oaks out here, and here's Thousand Oaks out here. So it's really in a completely different environment from Santa Paula, which is completely different from Ventura. So somebody said that they were from Newberry Park. Well, it's kind of in that same zone as Santa Paula. The thing about Ventura is it's in this, what's called the transverse range of mountains. So wind is channeled down through these different environments, boom, boom. And remember, sunlight and then wind are the main driving factors for water use. And so when you're in one of these, the Santa Rosa Valley or in Santa Clara Valley, you're going to get this wind channeling. And I swear on 118, the Las Posas Valley, this was last fall, suddenly all the plants, all the lemons, all the avocados turned crispy, the leaves, and it was, the Las Posas Valley is a howler of a valley. It's more narrow, and so that wind is more channeled, and so the water demand is higher there. So you can't always compare the water demand in the Santa Clara Valley to the Las Posas as to the Santa Rosa valleys. We live in a weird place, and it's one of the wonderful reasons we live here. So we actually have charts that show the average water demand. And the value of these charts is not in how to irrigate, but it's in how to design an irrigation system for the average and potential highest water demand. So when you're down here in the South Coast, where's my pointer? It shows a change that occurs seasonally, okay, versus what you see in the San Joaquin Valley. It's low in the January, February, March, and then it goes much higher. So this is the evapotranspiration shown in inches, and so this helps you design an irrigation system for the highest water demand. Okay, so you don't want to design a system for the average water demand, because you want to be prepared for the highest water demand. So a lot of homeowners will under-engineer an irrigation system. They'll put in half-gallon emitters when they really should be putting in 1 gallon emitters. And these charts, which are available through our office, or this one is available through the Department of California Department of Water. Or
Do you have a question if you're ready?
Yeah. I was going to say, well, or talk to the master gardeners; they'll help you.
That's right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Samantha's wondering, if it's a windy day and you forget to water your plants, does watering after help, or does it have to be done preventatively?
Well, ideally it's preventatively, but you want to get that water on as soon as the wind event is occurring, or just after. And we're going to get into that more specifically, but once water is depleted from the soil, a plant goes into water stress. And a plant in water stress is one that becomes more susceptible to infestation of disease and insects. Okay, so as soon as you can get back from Las Vegas, get the water on.
One more question.
Yeah.
Martina's wondering, when is the chart from? I'm assuming you mean age. If it's older, do you think it's changed much, especially toward the end of the year?
Age, you mean the plant age, or?
The chart's age. Have the numbers changed?
Oh, no, these are all relative numbers, and it okay. Shows you, if you're in Humboldt County versus Imperial Valley, the differences in water demand. So again, our weather patterns are so bizarre throughout California. So last year in Ventura City, we had 4 inches of rainfall. In 2005, we had 50 inches of rainfall. Wow. We had the early rains in December last year. And in 2005, we had rains that went into March and April. So that really, throws off our, how we water plants. Does that help?
I think that, yes, I think that answers her question. So yeah. It's all relative.
It's all relative.
Right.
You've got to be flexible,
Yes, float like a butterfly. That's right.
Yeah, and so yeah, exactly. So the the way you design an irrigation system is you talk to the master gardeners for this area. That's one other thing. Watch out for any information that comes from Arizona or Colorado or Minnesota or New York or Georgia or Fresno or San Francisco. We are a local environment. It's not just we are. San Francisco is a local environment. You know, Seattle is a local environment. So anytime you read information that comes from a different environment, it may be of some value, but don't take those figures as being absolutes. Okay, and I'm not just talking about water. I'm talking about fertilizing. I'm talking about weeds. I'm talking about, you know, the whole kit and caboodle. You know, you have to think locally.
Right. So Samantha has another question. She's wondering just more specifically about the location column. So the South Coast, the coastal valley / plains, that refers to Oxnard and Camarillo. Is
Yes.
that right?
Yeah.
And then
yeah,
the
yeah.
South Coast interior valleys, that's Thousand Oaks, Moore Park,
Yeah.
Simi, Westlake.
Yep.
Okay. All right.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah.
Okey-doke.
So that is trying to reflect that same thing with the map that I showed you of Ventura.
Right.
So even here, when somebody calls the helpline and they say, "How much water do I put on?" The first question should be, "Where do you live?" Are you in Oxnard? Are you in Ojai? Are you, in Piru? Whatever. It's like you can give generic information, okay, but if they want to get down and dirty, then you really have to know exactly where they're at.
All right. That's it for the questions.
Uh-oh, here we go. So for a lot of years when people had newspapers, I read a newspaper at least 3 times a week. But all the Ventura Star and the Santa Barbara News Press and used to have these tables in the weather section, and would show the amount of water that was used on a daily basis. So you could figure out, oh, I know how much water to apply. And these figures are online now. And we actually have 4 what we are called CIMMYS, California Irrigation Management Information Systems. And you can get online and look at that data. One of the stations is at Hanson, at Herrick. So that's specific information for the Santa Clara Valley. There's another one at off of Santa Rosa Road at the Leisure Village. And there's a third one in Oxnard. So there isn't one in Thousand Oaks, but you can develop by looking at the CIMMYS data. You've got to go online to see it now. It's no longer in print. Actually, if you go to our website, the county cooperative extension website, there's a link to the Santa Paula and Leisure Village stations, and you can print out this information. And again, this is the amount of energy that's arriving to potentially drive water use. So it's just telling you the amount of sunlight, wind, humidity, and the temperature. So again, if you have a small plant, if you have no plant, you have to adjust the amount of water, the total amount of water that's put on by the size of the plant that's there. So we calculate this information about the energy coming in by the size of the plant. We call that a crop factor, and that'll tell you exactly how much water. And so what this is doing is you look at the soil as a reservoir. Okay, and so as the ET arrives, it's going to pull water out depending on the plant, and you can accumulate those values to finally put on, well, after a week, I need to put on this amount of water. Now, these are measured in inches per day. You can convert that to gallons. There's ways of doing that. But it just shows you that when you have low or high ET values, you're going to put on more or less water. And there are actually some irrigation controllers that will get a signal from one of these stations that tells them how to adjust the amount of water applied. Now, I don't know of anyone that's using those in this area, but in Orange County, the Orange County Water Authority has put out millions of dollars funding free water controllers, and it's been quite successful there. So, so we've gone from how plants use water to how water is driven through a plant and off the soil through evapotranspiration. And now we've got to look at how water is stored in the soil. Okay, so you talk about sandy soils and clay soils, and the trick question here is, which uses more water, a sandy soil or a clay soil? Okay, so it's a trick question. Which uses more water, a sandy soil or a clay soil? You're thinking, I know, I can hear you thinking.
Just drop it in the chat when you're done thinking.
Yeah.
Let's see. Jeanette says soil doesn't use water. Oh. Laura says clay. I know, right? Deborah Eve says sandy goes through faster. Martina says neither. And Leanne says clay.
Okay, this is a really good discussion, because the idea that water has greater infiltration than sand, which means you can lose more water in a sandy soil than in a clay soil. Clay soils hold more water, but the thing that drives water use is the size of the plant and the amount of energy arriving. It's the sun, the wind, the humidity, and the temperature that drive water use. So actually, the reason why it's a trick is because it doesn't matter what the soil texture is. Okay, it's what are the outside factors that drive water use. What the soil is defining is the amount of water that's held. Okay, so more or less, there's 50% of a soil is solids, and the other part is voids. And when we talked about soils in the past, which has a greater amount of openings inside the soil? Soil openings are larger in a sand, but there's the total volume of those voids, those pores, is less. So a clay soil has more voids and more pores, and it holds more water. And so, a sandy soil has anywhere from 20 to 30% pores, and a clay soil can have as much as 80% pores. So it can hold a heck of a lot of water. So the volume of water that can be held is going to define the watering frequency. So a sandy soil has to be watered more frequently than a clay soil. The total water demand is going to be the same, because if it's growing in the same environment, the sun, the wind, the humidity, and temperature are going to be the same. So there's some defining terms here. Saturation is when all the pores are full. And then what happens is you fill those pores, and water is held by surface tension. Water holds itself. Okay, water molecules stick to each other. The water is sticky, and then it sticks to any surface. So you see this when you dribble some water on the table, and it makes these little puddles. Okay, so those puddles are caused by surface tension. So you fill the pores, and then the water will drain through gravity. And the water that sticks to the surface of the sides of the pores is going to be called field capacity. So usually, depending on the soil texture and the size of the pores, field capacity is achieved sooner in a sand than in a clay. So you can, after it rains, you don't want to walk on soil. It's going to compact it, it's going to decrease pore size. And pore size also determines the amount of aeration in the soil and the amount of air that roots see. And roots need air. So you never want to walk on wet soil. So you allow for field capacity to be achieved, which is 1 or 2 days, 3 days after watering. Okay, it's either rain or watering. And then the plant starts sucking water out of the soil, and they'll keep sucking water out. And according to the US Department of Agriculture, there is an official point at which plants can no longer pull water out. We call that the wilting point. And this is actually an assay that was used. They put in a sunflower plant in the soil, and they'd put it out, and they would water the plant, and then they'd look at how it pulled water out. And as water is removed from the soil, it doesn't move very easily. And so each day, the plant would grow well, and then in midday, it would wilt, okay? But that's natural. And during the rest of the day, when it got cool, and at night, remember the pores shut, and the plant would revive, and it would look bright and cheery in the morning. And then instead of at 3 o'clock wilting, it would wilt at 2 o'clock. And then during the night, it would rehydrate. And in the morning, it would look chipper again. And it would keep going through this process. And then finally, in the middle of the night, it would wake up and the plant would just be wilted still. And that's the wilting point. And by God, that is an official determination. So the water holding capacity that the plant can see is that water in between field capacity and wilting point. Okay, we call that available water. It's not the water held at saturation, because at saturation, there's no air, and the plant finds it very difficult to use water. It becomes asphyxiated. And so that cartoon that I first showed you of the plant, it's wilted, and the guy looking at it, he says, "Are you needing water or don't you need water?" And when the soil is saturated, plants will actually wilt. Okay, so the available water is the water that the plant can use, and that is the water that's in the soil after it's drained to field capacity and then at wilting point. So here's soil, okay? And when the soil is saturated, all the pores are filled with water, and this means the plant, the roots can't see any air, and they can, if you have a Santa Ana condition, you can have plants wilt. Even though you go out there and you go, "My gosh, it's still wet," and what do? You put on more water. It makes it even worse. And so the water will drain under gravity. Okay? In this situation, it's filled with water, and then gravity pulls water down, and the water that sticks to the pores walls is the water that's going to be held at field capacity. So when water is saturated and there's high demand, you can have wilting. So roots need air just like we do. And this is one of the complicating factors of living in a high rainfall environment. But here where we have control over the water, we can put on water to excess or to lack of water. And so we're in control of things, and this becomes kind of a personal thing. When you go up to a grower and you say, you're not managing your farm right, you're not watering right, and that's why you have root rot, that's why you've got dry root rot, that's why you've got all these problems. So you need to get it on. So you really have to be politic when you're talking to people, because it's, this is their baby, this is the farm that they live on. So you have to show them how to water. So when soil is dry, you can see that it's dry. And this is most clearly seen in clay soils and in, if you look at the gutter after it's rained and there's been erosion and there's muck in the gutter, you'll see this cracking going on. And so there's a shrink swell that goes on. So when soils are wet, they tend to expand. And then as water is evaporated from the surface, they shrink and they crack, and you can see that it's dry. So in some soils, this is kind of a false assessment of water content. In some soils, like silty clay loams, you'll get this surface cracking like this, and then you pull the cracks away and it'll be wet just below it. So this is not always the best way to determine when to water. You still need to dig down and see what's there. So plants wilt when there's lack of water. So they can wilt when there's too much water and when there's not enough water. And also when there's root disease, okay? When you have root disease, you don't have functional roots, or you have no roots at all. And the soil can be nice and wet, but the plant wilts because it doesn't have the capacity to take water up. So in general, okay, so if somebody from Ojai calls and they want to know how much water is in the soil that's adequate for the plant, or if somebody from Fillmore, if somebody from Thousand Oaks, or Newberry Park, or, God knows, from Colorado, you can always assess the amount of water that's available for plants by feeling it. Okay, this is called, it's actually a technical method of assessing water content that was developed by the US Department of Agriculture. So basically, available water is, if you squeeze that soil and water comes out, you've got too much water there. If you squeeze that soil and it dribbles out of your hand like at the beach, you don't have enough water. So you can always feel the amount of water content. And it's cool too. Water that's moist is going to be cool, and it's going to be darker colored. So as soils dry out, they tend to be a lighter color. But you can always manipulate a soil that has adequate water. Manipulate, you can always move it with your fingers.
Hey, so, Ben, there's another question.
Oh boy.
Martina wants to know, are there any tips for what you can do if the soil is saturated because of rains and doesn't dry out quickly? And then she says, blow dry the soil, which conjures up a lot of images for me. But
yeah. No, it's when we get a lot of rain, it's it's not good because we're not well designed to take rain. Now, if you drive out 126 in between Wells Road and Briggs Road, you'll see on the north side a lot of lemons that are planted on berms. Okay, berms that are these little hills that are about 3 feet high. And that's what people are doing now to improve drainage. Okay, you build an area that's higher than the surrounding area. Strawberry growers have done this forever. Okay, well, forever is about 50 years. If you live in Thousand Oaks and you've got a heavy loam or clay, you really want to, if you have perennials, shrubs and stuff like that, you want to raise them slightly. slightly meaning 6 to 8 inches or so. So that when you do get rain, you get better drainage. Now, you have to anticipate that. You're not going to, pull the plant out after it's rained and say, okay, I'm going to put it back in now at a higher elevation. But that's how you deal with it. You forecast the issue and then plan accordingly.
Samantha has a question also. She says, does turning the soil gently if it's too moist help to aerate it?
I don't like to see soil manipulated when it's wet, because whenever you put any kind of pressure on the soil, you're going to get compression of the pores. Okay, and that means ultimately you're going to have less air in the soil, less air for the roots, and make them more prone to root disease. So I stay away from the soil. Don't. I know you pitchfork types want to get out there and start, charging around, but
start digging.
yeah, go down to the beach and enjoy yourself. Stay away from it. This is one of the biggest problems with growers. They want to do something. Give me a bigger gun or something. You just say, no, leave it alone. Nature take its course.
One more question. Cheryl is asking, does planting on a berm also encourage wider root growth?
Okay, one of the things, this is a really important point. You don't want to plant on berms in Fresno because the soil is hot. Okay, it's 100 degrees air temperature and the soil is 180 degrees. And then when you plant on a berm, you'll get even higher temperatures. This study that we've done at Limonera, which is just off 126, the soils are cold here. Okay, and you plant on a berm and it warms the soil and you get bigger plants. I mean, it's incredible. 1-year-old plants there look like 3-year-old plants. They grow so much better. So a berm is going to be warmer. It's going to drain more. It's going to evaporate more water. So a berm is going to take more water, right? You got more surface exposed to the elements to drive water use. So you're going to be applying more water on a berm until you get, a canopy that covers it, which then protects the berm from wind, is basically. Did that answer the question?
Cheryl, does that sound good? Go ahead and turn your mic on.
Sure, but I was just wondering, if you plant on a berm, does the root system get bigger or is it just the same?
No. It elaborates itself within the berm. It actually have a much larger root system, and it's because it's well aerated. And when you irrigate, it drains better, and so you have more pores, but you're irrigating more frequently. So
got it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, you dig into a berm, and my gosh, it looks like a potted plant.
Wow.
And it's one of the problems that we had when. We stand on the shoulders of those who've gone before us and made a lot of mistakes. And George Goodall was the farm advisor in Santa Barbara, and Bud Lee was the farm advisor here. And they did a whole bunch of these studies trying to improve avocado survival with Phytophthora root rot. And one of the tricks was to plant on berms. Not on berms, but on mounds. Okay, a mound is a single raised area, and a berm is an elongated area. So you put in 50 trees on a berm, you put on 1 tree on a mound, and so they put these trees. They put a load of dirt on the ground, and it'd be about 2 feet tall. And oh man, these trees took off. They were growing so well until they started bearing fruit, and a wind came along and they went boom, they went down. They fell over. And so what happens, you create a discontinuity. Okay, so you've got the surrounding soil, and then you come in and you plunk some dirt down on top of that. And we talked about this in the soil section where, so water moves down into the berm, the mound, and then it hits the discontinuity and it moves out. So it moves through the berm, and then when it hits the base soil, the surrounding soil, it moves out. Water doesn't penetrate into the next layer. And so the roots would grow down and they'd hit this base layer and they'd stop because there wasn't any water there. And so you develop this potted plant there out in the field, and it just was not well rooted. And so now when we build these mounds and berms, we scratch away this, we bring the native soil in, the surrounding soil, and we make sure we scratch it well so that there isn't this discontinuity between the berm and the native soil. So yeah, it's it takes a little bit longer for the roots to move out into the surrounding soil, but you get a much more vigorous plant. Now, I'd really only do this on a heavy soil. I wouldn't, it's a lot of work to build these things. And, if you've got a normal loam, even up to a clay loam or so, I wouldn't do it. So anyway, plants use the available water immediately surrounding the roots. Then slowly water will move into that dry area, okay? And during the night, it re-wets that area, and then the plants take it up again. So, this is what happens with the wilting point. So it takes longer and longer and longer for water to move to the root as the days go on, to the point where the plant can't recover. So as time goes on, it takes longer and longer for water to move through the soil to the root, and gradually the plant dries out. So, that is going to tell you what the frequency is. Now, if you've got in the old days when people had grass lawns, this is, grass was pretty darn tough. It could take quite a bit of drought relative to a petunia or a violet or something else. And so one of the methods of evaluating when to water would be you go out there and you step on the plant and it springs back when it's well watered. And you do that day after day. And when you walk out there and you can see the mark of your shoe, that meant, oh, it's time to irrigate. So, that is a technique for determining the frequency of watering. So when the plant doesn't spring back, it's time to water. Yep. So here is what we call a soil moisture release curve. So as soil holds more and more water, okay, here's a clay soil out here that holds 60% soil moisture. Here's a sand that holds 25% soil moisture. And so as it, come on. Okay, as soil dries down, it gets harder and harder to take up. So this is a measure of the difficulty of taking up water. So it's hard to take up water. It's easy to take up water here. So as sand depletes the soil moisture and gets harder and harder to get water. Whereas a clay, it starts out with more water and it has a much more gradual depletion of water until it gets to the point where the plant can't take it out. So this is to illustrate how in a sandy soil, you need more frequent small irrigations. It won't hold as much water, okay? So when I go back to that question, which plant will take more water to grow, in a sandy soil or clay soil? Well, if you put on the same amount of water on a clay soil as on a sandy soil, yeah, you're going to use more water because all that water is going to infiltrate, leach out, go below the root zone. So when that occurs, yeah, you're going to use more water. And so we have these charts that show how water is used according to different soils. And you can go on to our website, or you can go to the US Department of Agriculture's Natural Resources Conservation Service. And maybe one of the master gardeners can show you how to do that. But there's the soil web, and you can go on there and you put your address in, and it will tell you what your soil type is. Okay, and we actually have names. They're called soil series. So here's the Bonca soil, and here's the Boomer soil, the Bonsall soil. It's a famous soil down in San Diego. The Carlsbad soil. So these are soils that have a certain physical, chemical, biological characteristic. So that allows them to be given a name. And it will tell you, if you go onto the website, it will tell you what soil series is and what the various soil properties are.
And quick
This
question,
is really,
what was that website again?
this,
That web-
the soil web.
Soil web.
Yeah. And but what I was going to say is that these are for undisturbed soils. So if you're in a housing tract, where they've scraped all the dirt off the hillside and then moved it around, this thing doesn't work at all. It's meant for areas that have been undisturbed, where the graders haven't moved in. And so then you're reliant on, figuring out what your own soil is. So water moves, and it's controlled by how it's moved by gravity. Okay, so you pour a cup of water out and it goes down. Okay, but and it moves from a point of being wet to a place of being dry. Okay, and it moves where salt is. It moves towards salt. And so one of the major issues especially around here along the coast, is there's a lot of salt in the water, and your faucets get covered with that calcium carbonate accumulation. That's a salt, and salts will actually fight with plants for water. Water moves towards a salt. Okay, it moves towards a dry spot, it moves down, and it moves towards surfaces. Okay, so these are the four driving factors for which direction water moves. So water in general will move down. Okay, this goes back to the question of mounds and so on. Okay, water will move down through gravity. Water wants to move down by gravity. So you've got a clay soil here and a sandy soil, or a sandy soil over clay soil. Water will move down until it hits another texture, another soil surface. And it wants to stay in the soil surface where it was born. It doesn't want to move into there until you get all the pores filled here. Remember, all the pores are filled. It's saturated, right? It's saturated. If you create a soil that has a certain texture and it becomes saturated, there's less air. Well, there's no air. And you get asphyxiation, and the roots don't like it. And then it keeps moving down, and it builds up until you actually get pressure from being fully saturated. And what's sheesh, it's the pores sides are pulling it, and then only will move into the next texture when all the pores are full. So this brings up the issue of backfilling a planting hole with a coarse texture. Okay, everyone knows that planting mix is going into a poor soil. It will make a better plant, right? Yeah, no, it's not true. Everyone knows that if your pot has drainage problems, you put gravel in the bottom, that will improve. This is how water moves. It moves in its texture that where it starts, and then it backs up, and only then will it move into the next texture. So if you put a potting mix, a planting mix into a hole with your plant, it's going to make it wetter. Or I was called out to a Caltrans site on Patterson Road in Santa Barbara, a long time, 20 years ago. And they put in all these expensive ornamental plums, and they'd put the irrigation line out and they made it too taut. And the drippers were right on the root ball. And then as it got hot or cold, slowly the drippers moved off. And so now they were in the bulk soil, the native soil. They weren't on the planting hole, and water moved right around the planting hole. Okay, water moves in the texture where it starts. So if you put it on the root ball where the potting mix is, and that potting mix is going to have a different texture from the bulk soil, the water is going to stay in that pot and it won't move out until it's fully saturated. So you create a more difficult environment for water movement. And it's not until the roots move into the bulk soil that it can start getting enough air. The same thing goes for the gravel at the bottom of a pot. Water moves down through the potting soil of the pot until it hits the gravel, and then it backs up and it creates a saturated condition, and you create a worse condition than if you had no gravel at the bottom of the pot. Uh-oh. I mean, there's some stories out there that just should be stopped right in the bud, but we keep proliferating them. Anyway, here's an example. This is out of Washington State, and it just shows you how water moves down, okay, and it hits these different soil textures, and it just doesn't want to move. Okay, it stops. Creating soil textural differences can cause real problems.
And Charlie has a question.
Yeah.
He wants to know, does water also move up toward the surface due to evaporation?
Yeah. And why, Charlie? Tell me why.
Turn on your mic, Charlie.
Well, similar to when the roots pull water during the day, it creates a void that the moisture goes to fill, right? So as the water on the surface evaporates, more water is drawn to that space.
And it moves from a wet site to a dry site. So
Yes.
water is moving with gravity, it's moving towards salt, and it's moving towards dry soil. So if you take a paper towel and put it in water, it goes up. Why? Because it's going up from wet to dry. So right on, yeah. And so this can be a real problem. If you're getting movement of water up to the surface, it then evaporates, and wherever water moves, it's going to carry salts. So salts don't evaporate. So you get this layer of salt. And how will water move then? Dun, dun,
Toward the salt.
Dun. It moves towards the salt away from the plant. So this is a real problem, So you want to reduce that evaporative loss, okay, because you want to save the water. You want to keep water moving down as much as possible. So, and we're fighting these these forces all the time, forces of evil. and salt is, it's a necessary evil. It's the nutrients that a plant takes up are salts, but too much salt can be a problem. Okay, the speed the water moves in the soil is largely controlled by soil texture. Okay, so how much sand or clay is in the soil. So water moves rapidly through a sand because it's got big pores, even though it's got fewer pores. Clay has a lot of small pores and it's got a lot of surfaces, and it's got a lot of water is attracted to those surfaces, so it doesn't move very fast. Okay, so here's a picture of a sandy soil. It's you see these large pores, okay, and you get rapid movement. And this goes back to not just water movement, but fertility. If you water frequently with small amounts in a sand, from a fertility standpoint, you want to fertilize frequently with small amounts as well. Whereas a clay can hold a lot of water, can have a lot of nutrients. In the good old days when we didn't do irrigation, when we planted trees based on rainfall, Ventura was the largest walnut growing area in the world. We had almost 50,000 acres of walnuts growing here. And they were planted on spacings of 80 feet by 80 feet. And that was so that they would have enough soil volume as a reservoir to hold the rainfall. And the growers would actually look for clay soils because it would hold even more water from rainfall. And the problem with clays is that you get poor aeration. There's more pores, but there's small pores. And not only does water move more slowly through it, but air does as well. So you tend to have higher incidence of root diseases in clay soils. And now growers look for sandy soils because we irrigate, and we don't plant on 80-foot spacings because we need to pay our loan officers off sooner. So we're actually planting a high density on 6-foot spacings. And we irrigate and fertilize really frequently with small amounts. And the walnut industry moved to the Central Valley because they had cheap water and cheap land. So soil texture affects the wetted pattern. So this is what you see in a sandy soil. You put water here and it moves more or less down because you have fewer surfaces to hold water. Gravity has a greater effect, so it's moving straight down. In finer textured soil, silty soil or clay soil, water has more surfaces, it has more small pores, so it tends to move out. Okay, so the same volume of water in the sand moves down further than it would in a finer textured soil. So why is this important? Well, it's going to affect how you lay your irrigation system out. Okay, so on a sandy soil, you need more frequent, more shorter spacing between the emitters than you would in a clay soil. You can actually space them quite a ways in a clay soil. More water is held in a clay soil than a sandy soil. So with the same volume, it's just not going to hold as much. So this goes back to rainfall. So, So if you get the same amount of rain, it's going to hold less within the root zone than in a clay. So clays hold more water. So most active root zones are the top 18 inches, and I'm talking about perennial plants, shrubs and trees. As you go deeper than 18 inches, those roots tend to be anchor roots. But most of the water uptake is occurring in the top portions of the soil where you have a lot of fine roots. And the reason why you have a lot of fine roots is there you've got a lot of air. Okay, the deeper you go in the soil, the fewer, the less air there is. And so you tend just to get these big old roots that hold the plant down. Okay, here comes that question again. Plants need more water in a sandy soil than they do in a clay soil. And so this really is, the driving factors are the environmental ones of sun, wind, humidity, and temperature. And if you put on more water than the plant can hold in the root zone, yeah, it's going to need more water because you're leaching beyond the root zone. It's going into that area where there's those big roots, but those big roots don't take up very much water. You know, they'll take up some, but you know, nutrients and water are primarily taken up by finer roots. And you can see by that, remember the picture that shows the water moving towards a root. Okay, the less distance of water has to move, the more likely it is that the root's going to be able to take it up. So sandy soils need more frequent small irrigations than a clay soil. So when somebody calls on the helpline, yeah, you have to get down to it. You know, is this a sandy soil or clay soil? And what may, you know, and when they ask you for a volume, you have to ask, well, you know, the volume is going to be affected by, you know, the rooting depth of the plant. So petunia is going to have, you know, fewer deep roots. When I say that is, you know, greater than 6 inches deep than, you know, a eucalyptus tree is. So, you know, small plants needs more frequent small amounts than a big plant, and a small plant in a sandy soil is going to need much more frequent small amounts than a big plant in a clay soil. So putting the same amount of water on a sandy soil as a clay soil pushes the water deeper in a sandy soil. And, you know, water that goes much deeper than about 18 inches is water that's not as effective as water that's kept in the top 18 inches. So here's a picture, the same volume of water applied is going to go deeper in a sand than it would in a clay soil. So what I'm trying to emphasize here is that, you know, you've got to adjust the irrigation frequency and amount to the texture of the soil. And also too, depending on the slope. So infiltration rates are going to change according to the texture. So a sandy soil is going to move in faster than in a clay. And as you move up a slope, it's going to, you're going to start getting the effects of gravity moving down slope versus deeper down in the soil. So when you're on a flat soil, you can put on more water than on a slope, you know, and that's because when you saturate a soil, you fill the pores to the point where it can't take any more water up. And what it does is it runs off. So when you get into that situation, what you want to be doing is decreasing the frequency and putting it on, decreasing the amount and increasing the frequency. Okay, so as you go up a slope, you want to put on smaller amounts more frequently, so you avoid runoff. So don't apply water at a greater rate than it can be infiltrated. Okay, you don't want to have runoff. And the likelihood of runoff increases as the soil texture gets finer, okay? Because you've got small pores in a clay soil, it doesn't infiltrate as well. Once the soil is saturated, it can't take up any more water, so it has a tendency to run off. So every plant's got a different architecture, and that's going to affect the frequency of application too. And the generally speaking, you want to be irrigating near the canopy, within the canopy. What can happen though is if you have roots that are much further out from the canopy, in areas that have rainfall, it can access that water. But generally speaking, you want to be irrigating somewhere in between the root, the stem of the plant and the greatest width of the canopy. So here's an example. These are drippers, and you want to be irrigating near the edge of the canopy. You don't want to be irrigating on the stem of the plant, the trunk of the plant. This is the most active physiological zone of the root system. And if you saturate that, you're going to start having problems. So you can see this plant is, I wish my pointer would work. You can see this is planted on a mound to ensure that you get good drainage around the mound. So when you're planting a perennial, it's always better to plant high than it is to plant low. So it's all right to actually expose a portion of the root zone when you plant in order to ensure that that is always well aerated. When you plant low, when you actually bury the stem, that means it's always going to be saturated when you water, and you're gradually going to start having problems with crown rot. So the wetted pattern, okay, the way you lay out your irrigation lines is going to be affected by the soil texture. So the distance between these emitters is going to be going to have different wetted patterns according to the soil texture. And soil water moves vertically. Okay, it's gravity that is pulling water down. It's the soil pores that are pulling it back and forth. So the pattern is determined by the texture, but it generally moves in a wetted front, as long as the soil textures are continuous. So water moves in a wetted front. So it's saturated here and it's dry here. And near this fringe, it's going to be in between saturation and, wilt. When you have poor distribution uniformity, when emitters are putting out different amounts of water, okay, when you have clogging, when you have some plants get too much water and others don't get enough, you're going to set up a situation where some plants are going to get too much water, others are going to get not enough. Plants getting too much water are probably going to get some kind of a root disease. The plants not getting enough water are going to get other complications. So one of the things that we like to do in the field is measure the uniformity of an irrigation system, a watering system. We used to, in Santa Barbara, we used to go to the different parks to do this. We do it with the parks department and put out catch cans, just cans, and we'd look at the water coming out or from sprinklers, or we'd actually put these under each emitter and then measure the amount of water that was captured by the cans, and we'd run it for 15 minutes or 30 minutes and then look at the amount of water captured and get the total amount and then divide it by the cans and then tell us what the average was. And then we take that average value and divide it by the amount that was the low amount. And it would tell us how efficiently the water was being put out, the distribution uniformity. And this would say you had a 70% efficiency of application. If it were every can put out the same amount, it would be 100%. And as you get clogging, as emitters get older, as you get branches that get in the way, emission uniformity diminishes. So ideally, you want to have a system that's putting out, as close to 100% as possible, which is impossible. But a new system that is well installed and well designed should be putting out at least 85% emission uniformity, which means 15% are, no more than 15% are getting a different amount from the average. So this is called the low quarter measurement. Most homeowners don't do it. Most parks department, most large water users do this on a regular basis. And so this shows you this shows you a good uniformity. This is about 90%, and this is a bad uniformity. You can see the difference. This is the difference amounts of captured water. And so this shows you, it's more or less even, whereas these are up and down. So when you get into a situation like this, you are setting up a plant, a yard, an area for plant health issues. So what causes poor distribution uniformity? Well, busted emitters, poor pressure, clogged filters. Most growers, most homeowners don't have filters. And then mixing equipment. And so, you go to Lowe's or Home Depot and, you bought an irrigation system and you put it in and they don't sell it any longer a year later. And so you buy emitters and throw them in, and no emitters from different manufacturers put out the same amount. They may be rated for a gallon an hour, but they, if it's coming from Hardy versus Olson versus some other, a 1 gallon emitter, they're not designed the same because they're designed for different pressures. And I don't know why they do it that way. It's not standardized, but mixing emitters is not a good idea. It's going to create poor uniformity issues.
Ben,
Yes.
I had a request from someone for maybe a short break. Is it a good time, or are you almost done? Or?
Well, I'm trying to get through this because it's almost done. But
Okay.
if you want to, well, what would you suggest? Because we have to have a discussion over the quiz. So yeah, why don't we take a 10-minute break?
Okay, that sounds
good idea. I like that.
All right. Go get a
Okay.
drink of water.
Yeah.
Back at 2:48, 2:50. Yeah, there
That's
you
it.
go.
Ben, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, shoot.
Have you ever seen drip irrigation installed? Basically, I'm going to call it in a circular pattern around plants rather than like a linear or a horizontal pattern.
Yeah, it's fairly commonly done. And that's usually something that I'm going to get into. The more drip emitters you put in, the more problem you're going to have with clogging. And so usually with drip, it's best to put in the largest emitter that prevents runoff. And so a lot of times when you see those circular emitters, those patterns with spaghetti tubing, those emitters are putting out like a 1/4 gallon an hour. So the smaller the emitter, the higher the likelihood of clogging. So I've seen that done. And the idea is that you're wetting a larger pattern. You're creating a larger wetted pattern around the tree. But usually it's better if you're going to come, you're trying to create a larger wetted pattern with drip. It's better to put in a larger dripper with a larger orifice, or one with the emitter installed within the line. These are called inline drippers. Inline drippers have a much lower likelihood of clogging. So, and then I'd put in a larger emitter, excuse me, a larger emission emitter, and that will get you a larger wetted pattern as well. So yes, I've seen that done, but if it's having to go to smaller emitters, it's, you know, over the long term, you're gonna have problems.
We actually have that out in the orchard at Calvet. Roanna, did you want to jump in here about that? Hello? Roanna?
Yeah,
Yeah,
so,
we, go ahead and talk about the drip system in the orchard.
well, we put the drip system in the orchard with spaghetti tubing with every 6-inch emitters around each tree in a circular pattern around each tree. And we sort of did that as an emergency. Those trees have to get watered and we can't water them by hand. And we didn't have time to figure out other emitters. We needed the simplest, fastest way to get water on those trees. So I don't think it was the most efficient way, but we now have Linda Codman, who is managing the orchard. And so she's taking that system and kind of adjusting it and fine tuning it for the needs, the differing needs of the different trees. So we're trying to do a better job, and what we did previously was not maybe the best example of irrigation, but it was the best we could do at the time. Is that what you wanted me to explain?
You know, that's so common. You know, it works initially, and then it becomes a maintenance issue. And that's one of the problems with drip in general. It's, you've got to maintain. I mean, there's so many advantages to a drip system. You know, they're easy to install, they're cheap, but man, they clog like crazy. And the smaller the emitter, the emission hole, it's, you know, it's more maintenance issues. You know, we put in these drip systems, and a lot of people don't put in filters. And even though you're on city water, there's junk that comes through, you know, the water systems, and you know, drip systems are really filter systems. They filter out all the gunk in the water, and that's what causes the clogging. So, I mean, I'm all for drip, but it just, you know, you got to have some time to look after them.
You know, we found putting the drip system in the orchard that you know, we had a bunch of different people working on it, and some of us don't have very strong hands, and the connections would pop out. So we turned the water, we turned the water on different rows, one row at a time. So we'd water one row per work day. And we were constantly needing to watch it because pieces would pop out, and then we'd have a lot of water. So there are a lot of problems, but better than watering by hand.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question about that?
Sure.
This is Jeanette. My job Friday is to unclog the emitters, and Linda said we'd probably be using a paper clip. Does that sound right? And she said you might have a good technique for unclogging to ask
No,
you during
there's
this
not.
class.
The best thing to do is put in a really good filter. And you know, but you go out to the orchards and everyone has their paper clip. You know, the problem with paper clips is that eventually you damage the orifice. and it's going to change the output. And that leads to, I mean, it may not seem like a lot, but these are low pressure systems, and there's drip, drip, drip. And if, you can create an orifice that's putting out drip, 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 or you can have one that drip, drip, and eventually you're going to start having problems, with distribution uniformity and ultimately plant health.
Can you talk about putting the drip on top of mulch versus underneath mulch?
Yeah, it's got benefits and issues with it. When you're putting it on the surface, you can see it working. You can see it if you have a consistent wetted pattern. You're getting good output. You know where the clogging is and where the clogging isn't. When you put it under the emitter, under the mulch, you can't see where it's clogged and where it's not clogged. You can't see where the gophers have gotten at it, and that's not just unclogging it, it is breaking it. And you can get a flood, or they may just take a bite out of the middle of it. And I've actually seen damage from coyotes where they've dug it up. But then you have less evaporative loss. You have fewer problems with people kicking it over. Drip systems are pretty darn tough when they're put in, but it can just take so much manhandling before it breaks. So, one way to deal with that is to have a water meter, and you can get fairly cheap water meters. When I say cheap, I'm talking about $75 or so. And so when you turn the emitter on, when you turn the faucet on, and you want to run, for 8 hours or 10 hours or 5 hours or 2 hours, whatever it is, the meter should give you the same reading for that time period. So you set up a time period where you're going to consistently, run the system, and it should give you the same reading on the water meter. If you're getting high readings, that means you got to break somewhere. If it's giving you low readings, that means you got to clog somewhere. So that means, that alerts you to, oh, I really have to look more closely at this.
And we have a couple questions in the chat. Mary, would you like to turn on your mic and ask your question? If you're still there. Her question was, how can you evaluate water uniformity when using drip in a vegetable garden?
You put
Sorry, here I am.
That's okay.
Yeah, you put the cans right under the dripper.
But it's dripping, it's a soaker hose, so it's dripping right into the ground.
Okay. Soaker hoses have their own problem.
Okay, that's what I'm wondering about, soaker hoses, yeah.
Yeah, soaker hose is a filter basically. And, you could, put a pan out, and the same concept, it'd be something long, linear. I'm trying to think of, just a roasting pan or something like that.
Yes, and, good. That's great.
And so, and then you'd capture a given amount of water. And most, I don't know about soaker hoses, but most drip tape, which is kind of a soaker hose, drip tape usually has emitters about orifices about every 6 to 8 inches, and they're rated for 5 gallons per 100 linear feet. And so you could back calculate about what you should be getting, but really what you're looking at is the relative differences in what is captured. And typically you want to get at least 5 samples to do that little calculation.
Yeah, I'm just not sure how effective it's watering my garden in general, and if I should go to a different kind of emitter.
I guarantee you a soaker hose is going to decline in its capacity, and uniformity over time. You know, and really that's a function of what quality of water
The material, yeah.
and material. And so clogging happens not just from dirt and bacteria, but the salts. You know, calcium carbonate will clog just like it does, you know, the edges of your faucet.
So when we're talking to the public and they ask what would be the best way to irrigate a garden, what would you recommend?
Depends on what the garden is. If you're into
Just a
xeriscape-
vegetable garden? You
a
know,
vegetable garden. Yeah, well, vegetable gardens. I would go
a
with
spray
conventional-
emitter, a spray emitter?
No, I would go with a drip emitter, but
Drip
make sure
emitter.
that you've got a filter system on. The thing
With your
about
filter
vegetable
system.
gardens, you know, you often you have different types of plants in there, and you know, you've got a tomato, and you've got you've pulled out the marigolds that you had there that the aphids have now totally eaten, and you know, there's a lot of variation in there. And so putting in a sprinkler type system, micro sprinkler system, you're going to be irrigating too much area with the same amount. So how big is your vegetable garden? What is it? 10
I've got,
feet by 50 feet? or something?
I think it's 8x4, 3 8x4s.
Oh, yeah, I'd go with a conventional drip, you know,
Yeah.
either drip tape or drip buttons.
Mhm. Yeah, it's not very big. They're just raised beds,
Mhm.
8x5, but thank you.
Sure. So that, are we, no, is it not?
Yeah, I
time?
think we're, there's still a
okay.
few people missing, but I think we can. I think there was one more question I wanted to ask really quick. Hold on. Bev wants to know, she says, a gardener once told me that broadcast irrigation is best for a slope rather than drip irrigation. Is there any truth to that?
There's truth to everything. And, you know, the thing is what is on that slope and what is the potential for runoff. And so whatever the system is that you use, you don't want to see any runoff. The likelihood of runoff is, you know, the possibility of runoff is true for either drip or broadcast sprinkler, high impact sprinkler, something like that. But it's less so for drip. The thing about planting on a hillside is that, you know, you may want to do a drip initially on planting, you know, if you're putting in shrubs. And then as they get bigger and you get coverage, I mean, a hill slope should never be bare, you know, oof, you know, because when it does rain, you're going to have a mess at the bottom of the hill.
Right.
But eventually you may go to an overhead sprinkler. So let's say you put in myoporum or something, you know, a ground hugging myoporum on the slope. Okay, you start out with drip. Drip is cheap, you know, it might cost you $150, big deal, you know. And then with as the plants close in, you put in a micro sprinkler, okay? And that's relatively cheap too. So whatever, you know, water management is, it's not a one-shop deal. I mean, you're going to be playing with it the rest of your life.
Okay, thanks. All right, I think mostly everyone's back, so I think we can continue.
Okay, so that leads into the, you know, there's a lot of different sprinkler types, emitter types out there. And they all have their attributes, you know. Soaker hose does work, but it's not going to work after a while. It's guaranteed not to work after a while because you're going to get clogging, you're going to get bacterial clogging, you're going to get chemical clogging, primarily calcium carbonate. Portable sprinklers. I actually have a portable one of these sprinklers here that, you know, rotating, oscillating sprinkler. And because I don't irrigate my yard. I don't irrigate. I don't believe in it. But I do have a little garden, a vegetable garden. And on that, I'm using this inline drip tape. And I'm doing that because there's a lower tendency of clogging. You know, you've got plants coming in and out, you know, over the season. There's inline drip tape. There is what we call button drip tape. Turns out button drip tapes are easy to replace, but they have a higher tendency to clog than the inline drip tape. There's full coverage. These are usually high impact sprinklers, and they have their place. You know, it's not, you know, they've got large orifice. They don't clog. You don't have to have a filter. I mean, you know, if you get those old Challenger brass things, they'll last for 50 years and still, you know, be very efficient. But you use them where you have a, you know, a lawn system. You use them where you have the same planting type. You know, the thing to remember is that, you know, different plants have the capacity to use less water than others. And you don't want to be watering everything in the same fashion if you've got a lot of different types of plants. And then we have micro sprinkler systems, which, and again, there's a whole lot of different types of micro sprinklers. There's what are called fan jets, there's these spinner types. There's a lot of choice, and it's usually best not to mix them. If you've got a mix of plants, if you've got all shrubs, you know, it's best to stick with, you know, a button drip, okay? Because you can put those buttons in wherever the plant is, unlike the inline drippers. Drip tape, you know, that's spaced every 6 inches, and you may not have plants every 6 inches. Same thing goes for the micro sprinklers. You don't want to be mixing the different types of micro sprinklers. So each one of these have a value in a certain situation, and you want to use the advantages that that system allows you, and not try and kind of make an average mix and match of stuff. So there's these inline drippers, which tend to be quite good and tend to have lower clogging than the button types. Okay, and the thing is, these are spaced at a certain distance, and so it's hard to get differences. With all systems, you need, especially the low pressure ones, micro sprinklers especially, and drippers, you want to have a vacuum breaker so that when you shut off the water, you don't get the garden water being pulled back into the house. You want to have pressure regulators, a filter, check valves so that water doesn't back up. Yep. So, you know, drip systems can be really complicated, and, you know, each component has a certain function, and the more parts you put into it, the more fragile it is. You know, it's surprising how, you know, if you have a dog in the backyard and it runs into it, boy, you got an afternoon going down to the hardware store to get parts to fix it. They're just not very sturdy. I say that drip systems were designed to break, and they will break, and they will clog. And so with drip systems, you're working with hoses at a certain dimension, usually 1/2 inch, 3/4 of an inch. In agriculture, you see 1 inch drip. Oh, why is it doing that? You see these fairly large hoses, and that's so that they can run long distances. So most of our drip hoses are only designed to go, you know, no more than about 200 feet or so. So the length of that is going to be a function of the amount of drippers, the amount of the volume of water you're putting through the system. So the more water you put through the system, the larger the hosing has to be. So in general, these microsystems, and a microsystem is anything that's designed to run at low pressure. So if you need a pressure regulator on a system, you were talking about the emitters popping out at the vet center. Maybe the pressure regulator is not set right. So they're all designed to be running at about something less than 20 PSI. And they're all designed to run at a given pressure. So if you're running it at 30 PSI, the emitters are going to pop out. If you're running it at 5 PSI, you're going to get really poor uniformity.
We had some problems at first with the pressure regulators, but that we got that straightened out, and it worked out okay. But I think part of the problem was just what I said, was that we weren't strong enough,
To push them in. Yeah.
to push them in.
Yeah. If you did it enough, you'd get enough power to do it. You should work out every day. Yeah, they can be hard on you. I put in a system once, and when I was finished, oh, my fingers hurt so much. Anyway, the advantages of these low pressure systems is they're easy to lay out. You can put them in any configuration. So the question is, can you encircle a plant with spaghetti tubing? Yeah, you can do that. I mean, it's designed to be very flexible. They're cheap. They wet small areas, so weed growth is less. There's a much lower tendency for runoff, and they run at low pressure. So you can often run more large areas with a drip system than you can with a high pressure system. Okay, it's just that you're putting less water out, so you can do a larger area, but they have to run longer. Okay, so with high pressure systems, you're often running, for an hour, no more than an hour. Okay, with the low pressure systems, you're running for 24 hours. So you're exchanging runtime for the amount of water that you can run. Okay, disadvantages, they're easily damaged. I guarantee you they will be damaged, and they are high maintenance. They clog easily. Per emitter, they don't cover large areas. So if you're trying to do a lawn, if you're trying to do a contiguous planting of shrubbery, it gets to be a maintenance issue. The fewer emitters you have out there, the less clogging you're going to have. So they're high maintenance. Soaker, subterranean advantages, they have fewer weeds, but they are going to clog. They're going to clog. Okay, so now a little bit of chemistry. Any questions about emitters, emission types? Okay. One of the issues that we have along the coast here is salts. There's mineral salts in the water. Salts are good because calcium is a required nutrient. Sulfur is a required nutrient. There's not so much potassium, but too much salts are bad, even if good salts. And if you don't put enough fertilizer on, that's bad too. So there's an issue of water quality that comes with irrigation. So the rules of thumb are with total dissolved solids, and you get this from the water report. So every municipal irrigation, every municipal water system. So the city of Ventura, the city of Santa Paula, the city of Thousand Oaks has Callegas delivering water, and it must provide an annual analysis of the water. And that includes not just the salts, but radium and cadmium and stuff like that. Anyway, so if good water in this area is something less than 1,000 part per million. 1,000 part per million is that if you have 1,000 weight per million weight of water. So if you've got a million pounds of water and you have fewer than 1,000 pounds of salts, that means you've got good quality water. And so you're looking at the total salts, the total dissolved solids, and then specific ions, chloride, sodium, and boron. And these four components are going to tell you whether and how frequently you're going to need to leach. And so this is the water report from the city of Ventura. And so what I'm looking for is the TDS, total dissolved solids, and 900 average, but it goes above 1,000 part per million. So it means you're going to have some kind of leaching going on. And you want to have, for chlorides, they're recommending, they're recommending 500 part per million, but for most plants, 100 part per million is what you want to look at. So the chemical properties of the water are going to tell you what you're going to have to do. So water that is used in a house, okay, house water that's, for everything from showering to, washing dishes, laundry, uses about 1/4 of an acre foot. An acre foot of water is an acre foot of water is, I'm blanking right now. Whatever it is. It's getting late in the day. So even the, I don't know why it's doing this. So you're actually putting a lot of salt into your backyard, into your house. And if it's going on to plants, that can cause problems. And oftentimes what you'll find is that if you've got drip emitters, if you've got micro sprinklers, the thing about high pressure systems, the champion sprinklers, they're designed for overlap. So you got even pattern of emission. All the low pressure ones will put out water, it changes with distance from the emission point. And if you start looking at how much water is being put out, and you start looking at the amount of salts that are being put out, with less water, you're going to start having an accumulation of salts. So a lot of times you can find a salt ring, okay, when you look at a drip system and you look at the surface wetted pattern, and it's, the question came up, what happens to water as water moves up? It carries salts, and those salts then accumulate around the wetted pattern, and the salts move out towards the outside of that wetted pattern. And that's when it creates a salt ring, which can limit the ability of plants to take up that water. So it may be wet, but because there's salt there, the plants can't get that water. So what we need to be doing is looking at ways of conserving water. And when I say conserving water, it's not just to not have less water and saving money. It's every time we irrigate, every time we put water on, we're putting salts on, and it starts causing an accumulation. So at some point, we're going to have to put on excess water to move that water through. So if we can reduce the total amount of water applied, we're going to be putting less salts on. So you want to conserve water by grouping plants, by mulching, making sure, you've all seen this Caltrans, it's got its sprinklers going and it's raining, so rain shutoffs. Make sure the wetted pattern is on the area that you want it to be. you want to, if you're using controllers, adjust them seasonally and turn them off when it's raining. And then there are some controllers that use soil moisture controls to turn them on and off.
And a couple questions
Yeah.
in the chat. Kathleen would like to know, are chloride levels different in various parts of Ventura?
Yes. And so the city of Ventura, or city or county? Well, I'll answer that. Yes, they are
Okay.
different. And so just in the city of Ventura, there's water that's coming out of 4 wells and then the Ventura River. And any well water is going to have a higher level of salts. But what those salts are going to be determined by the geology of the area. When water comes out of the Ventura River, the salinity is going to change depending on the rainfall. So the chlorides are going to vary depending on seasonality. When you look at the water that's coming out of the Saticoy area, there's a Saticoy well out there that is terrible. You know, it's not just chlorides, but total salts. So if you're in the east, so that Saticoy water tends to stay on the east side of Ventura versus the water that's coming out of the Ventura River on the west side. When you go to Santa Paula, they're taking water out of some wells. They're all, but the wells are right next to Santa Paula Creek. Santa Paula Creek has got some really, that water is coming out of that, you know, that valley where those oil wells are, and you can smell the sulfur. And, you know, some of that water is just awful. You go to Thousand Oaks, you go to Newberry Park, that water is coming out of the Feather River. It's coming down the California Aqueduct. It's going to, you know, it's good quality water. You know, it's really great water, but it's coming from 800 miles away.
Right.
The city of Oxnard, you know, is getting metropolitan water too. That's Feather River water, but they put in that great system, which actually takes wastewater, you know, from the sanitation system, and it purifies it to the point where they have to add salt to it in order to make it usable. And it's high quality water. It's super duper water. So it all depends on the source of the water. And, you know, and water does change over time. If it's well water does change. There's a big fight going on with water that was coming out of the Santa Clara region of LA County. They were dumping it was treated water, but it had a high chloride level. And it was because there were a lot of soft water treatment systems in houses. They outlawed those.
Oh.
They outlawed all installation of them about 25 years ago, but then they started paying people to replace them with potassium chloride systems, which reduce the amount of sodium, but it still put a lot of chloride in. So it changes by regulation as well.
Another question, Jeanette would like to know, does rain barrel water have less salts?
In theory.
Yeah, you don't, right?
Yeah, the rain barrel water, you know, when the first rain comes down, it runs off your roof, right? And what's on your roof? All that bird stuff. You know,
Ash and bird and
yeah, right,
everything
yeah,
else.
yeah, everything else.
And then
Yeah,
one
but
more question
Okay.
from Kathleen again. She'd like to know about the chlorides added for disinfection, like chlorine, and she's wondering if it dissipates over time.
Chlorine gas dissipates. Okay, chlorides don't. Okay, chlorine is a gas, chloride is a salt.
Okay.
So bleach is sodium hypochlorite. And so that actually, it's 5 grain or 6 grain or whatever it is. You know, you can smell it, right? So if you can smell it, it's evaporating. It's going off. Yeah.
All right, that's it from the chat.
Yeah. Okay, let's go on. I was going to be talking about ET controllers. They're being used down in Orange County, and they work, but they come with costly fees sometimes. Usually because you're linking it to the CIMUS network, and in Orange County they've actually put in extra CIMUS stations. So there's a monthly fee, and I forget what it is. It was something, not too much. It was like $4 a month. But it does put on less water. And the thing is, it puts on the amount of water that the plant needs. And if you can meet the water needs with what the plant needs, excuse me, the water application with what the plant needs, you can have a healthier plant. The thing is, too, the water that the plant sees, water in the soil, can be no better than the water that's applied. So if you got poor quality water that you're putting on, it's only going to get worse because the plant concentrates, it pulls out the water that it can, and it leaves the salts behind. So salts will accumulate. The poorer the quality that you put on, the poorer the water quality that the plant's going to see. So the rule of thumb is put the water where the plant is, not in the gutter. One of the problems with a poor distribution uniformity in a system is that you have to put out more water in order to control the salts. So you end up using a whole lot more water. And so you want to group plants according to water requirements. And that's also when you put them together, typically a lower water requiring plant is also a plant that can tolerate more salinity. Here is an important point: irrigate crop plants to optimum production. So you may want to water your vegetables with more water than you would with your landscape plants. It's amazing how little water plants can use and look good. Okay, if you're trying to grow the maximum amount of zucchini, you've got to put on the maximum amount of water as well as the maximum amount of fertilizer. So you irrigate landscape plants typically at a lower amount than you would a production plant. I had a fruit tree teacher in college who said, if you want to create a lot of hay, put on a lot of water. And that means you have to prune it out. So the more of anything you put onto landscape plants, it creates more work. So less water, within reason, you just don't want to stress them. It's amazing how little water plants can have without getting stressed.
There's a question in the chat, Ben.
Yeah.
Does using gray water add salts to the soil too?
Anytime water has been used, it's going to accumulate salts. Gray water is water that's coming from sinks and showers and laundries. So that's all been used once. Usually the old permits were only for laundry water. Okay, and so that's just soap. And they used to put a lot of borax in water, and they pulled that out now, I think. They used to put a lot of phosphorus in. So you're actually putting on nutrients. And so what you're putting on then with your gray water is lint and dirt. So you got to make sure you got a good filter because it's guaranteed to clog. And so, yes, you are putting on salts. And so you got to monitor your plants then. The symptoms of salt damage are that marginal necrosis. So just keep your eye out for what's going on. And you may need to, put on supplemental water from, from the faucet.
Okay, thank you.
So mulching is important in water conservation. Keeps the weeds down. Oh, what happened? It's over. I thought I had some more in there. Anyway, my parting words for you are don't walk on wet soil. I had a teacher, Alan Chadwick, who told me when asked what's going to lead to the demise of civilization as we know it, and he said people walking on wet soil. and you can really see it, you know, and a nice beautiful soil that you've, you know, been tending for years, you can destroy the soil in you know, in just a few steps. So any questions?
Hold on, there's one in the chat. Let's see. Oh, just a comment. Someone said, Kathleen says she only uses gray water for the grass.
You know, the grass, Kathleen, where do you live?
Kathleen?
Ventura.
Ventura City. Okay, great. That means you've got Kikuyu lawn. Kikuyu is the toughest darn grass. And you know, you go out and you spend lots of money putting in a marathon lawn, and I guarantee you within 18 months it's Kikuyu. Kikuyu will take lots of salts. It was imported by the USDA for soil conservation, to protect soils. So yeah, most grasses, most turf grasses can take a lot more abuse than you know, your vegetable garden. So
Right.
yeah.
Bev does have a question. She'd like to know how close to the plant stem should mulch be?
It should be no closer than 4 to 6 inches. The problem with mulch is that it retains moisture, and if it's up against the crown of the tree or shrub, you're going to create crown rots. So you got to keep it spaced away somewhat.
All right. Are there any other questions? I think Dr. Faber, are you done? It looks like the end.
We do have a quiz. Do we want to go through the quiz together real quickly?
There you go. Yep.
Yeah. Thank you for monitoring the questions.
Oh, you're welcome. My pleasure.
Okay, you're looking at the quiz or presentation mode?
Quiz.
Okay, good. All right, then please feel free to unmute yourselves and, you know, share answers, and we'll have a discussion about each question, assuming I can get a slide to advance.
Okay, which soil texture has the greatest ability to hold water and hold and store water? So people are going to raise their hands or just shout it out, or
Clay.
Clay?
Yeah.
Clay.
yeah, clay.
I think people are going to unmute themselves.
Oh yeah, go ahead. Are you looking at the questions? I'm still stuck on the first page. My slide.
Right.
Won't
That's what we're seeing is the first page. Is there a presentation mode for that?
I mean, there should be, but of course the
I
slide
think-
won't advance. Okay, so you were all sent the quiz. So go ahead and just open that attachment. And
Yeah, just
we'll go through them.
Oh, we were?
yeah,
Did
click
we
on the
all-
next slide.
Email included that attachment that she sent yesterday.
Okay.
Oh,
Okay, what's the
It
difference
has the
between
answers on it.
Yeah.
oh.
It has all the answers.
How do you do that?
So you want to just read through them and then we'll talk about them? Or
You bet. Alexa?
go.
Oh, here she comes. There you go.
Okay.
Perfect.
Try something else here. All right, here we go.
Okay, distinguish among the terms saturation, permanent wilting point, and available water holding capacity.
I have it written down on here.
Anyone want to take a shot at that?
Dab at it.
Mhm.
Duration. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, the most water that the pores can hold, and the wilting point is when the plant won't recover after it's tried to struggle to remove as much water as it can. And so the permanent wilting point is the end point, and the yeah, and so the available water holding capacity is the difference between the water holding capacity, yeah, right.
It's that time of the day, Ben.
Yeah. Okay, what might be a difference in water strategy for an ornamental versus a crop plant? Ooh.
Ooh, lots of people. More water for vegetables crops needed than for ornamental plants in general?
Yeah, it's
agree.
basically how
Amount.
much vegetation do you want to create? And so the more water within, reason that you put on, the more growth you're going to get. A lot of people talk about cacti. Oh, you don't need to put any water on cactus. Well, if you want a cactus to grow, you got to put water on it. And if you go to a cactus nursery, they are putting everything, as much fertilizer and as much water on because they want to sell those plants. So, yeah, so it's the amount of growth that you want. And for most ornamental plants, you want something that looks good. You grow it up fast, you put on a lot of water and nutrients, and then you can cut back. Suggest 2 methods for determining the water status of a soil. Oh my goodness, we didn't, for most homeowners, it's just, taking a trowel out and checking for, can you manipulate the soil? There are, some people that use the ET-based method. And so that's really not estimating soil moisture content. It's estimating how much energy is coming to drive water loss. There are soil moisture sensors that will actually, they work really well. You go down to Green Thumb and buy one for $8 and it gives you some pretty reliable results. The thing is, they only have a rod that's about 8 inches long, which is more than adequate for most gardens. They tend to be pretty fragile, so you buy a new one every year. And so just basically using a trowel and checking with your fingers. Suggest 2 advantages and 2 disadvantages to a drip system. Whoa. That ought to be easy.
Yeah, Laura says clogging and not watering in a wider square foot to encourage root growth.
Yeah, I mean, that's a disadvantage. The thing about drip is that it's designed for frequent small amounts. So as long as you could keep up with the water demand, it doesn't matter whether it's wetting a large or a small area. So that can be an advantage and a disadvantage. The thing about them is that they typically have less weed growth. So if you wet a smaller area, you can have less weed growth.
Some people say high maintenance, fewer weeds, they clog easily. They're cheap. Yeah,
cheap, they're easy, they're flexible. What is distribution formula? Oh, why is distribution uniformity important when you're irrigating?
That's me. Let's see what the chat says. Oh, more thinking on this one, not as quick in the chat box. Anybody?
Okay, one of the causes of poor DU is animals chewing on it. Yeah, but why is it important to consider? Consistent plant growth. Yes. So if you've got if you put out 5 hawthorn plants and you want them all to grow the same, you got to have the same water going on.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is, if you have high differences in plant or water going out to a plant, some plants are going to get too much water and some aren't going to get enough, and you're going to get a plant health issue. The other thing is, you're going to be, every time you irrigate, you're going to be putting different amounts of water out and salts. And so the ones that are getting the least amount of water are going to be accumulating the most salt. So I mean, that's one of the problems of having poor DU. You know, you're going to get problems with plant growth. Suggest and explain 3 water conservation measures. Mulch, yeah.
Lots of mulches. Group like plants together.
Yeah.
Don't water the concrete. Correct plants for the area. Mulch.
Yeah. Group plants as well.
Yeah.
If you have a sandy soil, you'll need more water to grow a plant than with the clay soil. True or false?
Oh, lots of falses. False.
Yeah. I love it. Suggest
They were
2
listening.
methods. Yeah.
They were listening. That was good.
Suggest 2 methods for dealing with saline waters. This is kind of a trick question. I covered it pretty from the edges. How do you deal with highly saline waters?
And it says
Leach. There you go. Cool. Yeah. What else? Any other suggestions?
Nothing yet. Oh,
How do you?
yes, you did spell that correctly. Yes. Conserve water, less watering.
Yeah. Well, one is that certainly with more saline waters, you have to have a good distribution uniformity. I mean, that's the key to dealing with saline waters. You cannot buy anything to improve. Plant accordingly.
I like the
plant.
Charlie says plant salt filtering plants. There you
Salt
go.
filtering plants?
Yes.
I don't know about that. Maybe. But if you're saying that there are plants that can tolerate more salt, yes, that's true. So if you've got highly saline waters, don't plant strawberries. You're going to have a problem. But a lot of plants, you know, Raphiolepis can handle a lot of salt. Eucalyptus can handle a lot of salt. But some plants inherently, redwoods, oh my gosh, you know, they smell salt and they die. So cherries don't like salt. In general, stone fruits don't like salt. In general, perennial evergreens like citrus and avocados don't like salt. But that's a good point. Anytime a plant holds on to its leaves, it will have some problems. You know, a plant like cherry, apple will, you know, every year it drops its leaves, so it gets rid of salt. So cherry will have more salt tolerance than a citrus plant. But I mean, there's some plants like walnut are really salt tolerant. So, and then any annual plant, you know, that is in the ground for the shortest period of time exposed to salts is going to do better. Suggest, yeah, me too. Suggest a procedure for assessing the amount of water to apply to an area. How do you figure this out? I mean, hello, how much water do I put on my yard? How do you figure this out? What's that?
Depends on the plants you have, what you're, you know, how much, you know, you keep the plants that need a lot of water in one area and plants that don't need a lot of water in another area.
Yeah, okay, that's one. What else?
Martina says, determine the type of soil. Where do you live and what are your plants?
Yeah.
What type of soil, Laura? Good.
Yeah.
Climate.
Climate, yeah, what's
Yeah.
the rainfall patterns been?
Yeah, Cheryl says microclimates and install irrigation for that. Jeanette says evaluate current soil moisture levels.
There you go, boom, that's right. That's right, the heart of it is like,
Right.
if there's moisture in the soil, you're gonna be in the ballpark.
Yep, Ariane says find out how much water is already being emitted.
Yep.
Kay says dig into soil and see how wet it is after watering. Yep.
Yep.
Good. 100% on the final.
Mhm. So
All
are
right,
there
is
any
that the last
questions?
question? Any other questions? Doesn't look like it. See,
You guys all
did
want
such
to
a
go
good
surfing or
job.
something? Oh, yeah,
Drinking
right.
a cup of tea, right?
Yeah.
All right. I think that's it.
Thank you,
Okay.
Ben.
Thank you. Have a good
Yes,
day.
thank you.